The millionaire proposed to his maid to adopt a child he needed to care for. The love for the boy ended up uniting the two forever. The phone rang for the third time that morning in the office of the Hampton Mansion in Greenwich, Connecticut. Griffin Morrison, 38, stared at the cell phone screen with a mixture of frustration and despair. It was the social worker again, reminding him that the deadline was running out. His fingers drummed nervously on the polished surface of the mahogany desk as her words echoed in his mind. "Mr. Morrison, in order to adopt your nephew Michael, we need assurances of a stable family environment." Family. Stable? Two words that seemed to mock him. Griffin ran his hand through the prematurely gray-brown hair at his temples, a legacy of the stress of the last few months since the tragic deaths of his brother Ryan and his sister-in-law in a car accident. Little Michael, just 6 years old, was all that remained of their family. Outside her office, Alma Rodriguez, 32, was methodically organizing the adjacent library. Her movements were precise and silent, as if she were afraid of disturbing the air around her. Over the last 5 years as the housekeeper at Hampton Manor, she had learned to become almost invisible, a skill she considered necessary in her position. "Miss Rodriguez," Griffin's voice cut through the silence, startling her slightly. "Could you come to my office, please?" Alma straightened her navy blue uniform and entered the room, maintaining the professional posture she always displayed. "Yes, Mr. Morrison?" Griffin watched her for a moment. Alma was different from the other employees who had worked there. There was a dignity in her bearing, a keen intelligence in her brown eyes that always intrigued him. "I need your help with something unusual," he began, choosing his words carefully. "It's about Michael." The child's name instantly softened Alma's expression. Since the boy had arrived at the mansion, she had become his main caretaker, filling the void left by the loss of her parents with stories in Spanish and homemade cookies. "The social worker has made it clear that she will not approve the adoption without me presenting a suitable family structure," Griffin continued, his voice betraying a vulnerability Alma had never witnessed. "I need to get married." The silence that followed was as thick as fog on a winter's morning. Alma waited, sensing that there was more to come. "I'm proposing a deal," he said, getting up and walking over to the window overlooking the gardens where Michael was playing with his dog. "A marriage of convenience. On paper only, with adequate financial compensation, of course." Alma felt her blood run cold in her veins. "Are you asking me to marry you?" "It would be temporary," Griffin clarified quickly. "Only until the adoption is finalized. You'd keep your job, your room in the staff wing. Nothing would change, except on paper." But they both knew he was lying. Everything would change. "Why me?" Alma asked, her voice just a whisper. "Because Michael trusts you. Because you're the only person in this house who's made him smile since he arrived. And because," he hesitated, "you're the only person I could trust with this." Alma watched Michael through the window, her heart squeezing as she saw the boy so similar to the photographs of Ryan that decorated the mansion. She knew the pain of loss. She had buried her own parents at a young age in San Diego, moving across the country in search of a fresh start. "If I accept," she began cautiously, "we need to establish clear rules." Griffin nodded, returning to his seat. "Naturally. And I need you to understand something," Alma continued, finding courage she didn't know she possessed. "I won't do this for the money. I'll do it for Michael." Something changed in Griffin's expression, a mixture of respect and something else that Alma couldn't identify. "I understand." That night, after putting Michael to bed with yet another story about dragons and knights, Alma sat on her small bed in the staff room, staring at her reflection in the mirror. What she was about to do would change not only her life, but the lives of everyone in the house. On the other side of the mansion, Griffin stood in his office, gazing at the family portrait of him and Ryan's children, their parents smiling in the background. The business empire he had built seemed empty now. All the money in the world couldn't buy what he really needed, a family. The deal was done, but they both felt they had started something bigger than they could control. The walls of Hampton Manor, which had witnessed generations of Morrison secrets, would now hold one more. A marriage built on need and compassion, but which maybe, just maybe, could turn into something more. The next morning would bring the start of a new life for everyone. A life where the lines between employer and employee, between convenience and reality would begin to blur dangerously, and as night fell over Greenwich, neither of them could sleep, their minds filled with doubts about the future they had just planned. The engagement ring weighed on Alma's finger like a constant reminder of the forest she was about to live. It was an antique piece from the Morrison family, with a solitaire diamond that Griffin had insisted on giving her to keep up appearances. Sitting in the justice of the peace's office in Greenwich, she nervously adjusted the hem of the most formal light blue dress she owned. "The documents are in order," announced Judge Peterson, a white-haired gentleman who seemed to have performed more marriages than he could count. "We just need the signatures." Griffin, impeccable in his Italian suit, maintained his usual composure, as if he were just closing another business contract. But Alma noticed the slight tremor in his fingers as he picked up the pen. Michael was waiting outside with Mrs. Bennet, the temporary nanny. Through the ajar door, Alma could hear his childish laughter echoing down the courthouse corridor. That sound was her reminder of the real reason she was there. "I now pronounce you man and wife," proclaimed the judge, without much ceremony. There was no kiss, just a formal handshake that made Alma feel even more the social gulf between them. Back at the mansion, the changes began immediately. Griffin had prepared an elaborate story for the staff, a discreet romance that had blossomed over the years, kept secret out of professionalism. Most seemed to accept it, although Alma could feel the curious glances and whispers in the corridors. "Your things have already been transferred to the master suite," Griffin informed her as they climbed the stairs. "I thought we'd better keep up appearances in case the social worker makes any surprise visits." The suite was larger than the entire apartment where Alma had grown up in San Diego. A door connected it to the dressing room that would be hers, arranged with new clothes that Griffin had ordered in her exact size. "I didn't need all this," she protested, touching the thin fabric of a dress. "Alma," Griffin sighed, running a hand over her tired face, "you are now officially a Morrison. Certain expectations come with the name." That evening, over dinner, Michael watched them with childlike curiosity. "So now you're going to be my real aunt?" he asked Alma, his big eyes full of hope. "Yes, darling," she replied, feeling her heart squeeze. It was the first lie she had ever told the boy. Later, after putting Michael to bed, Alma found Griffin in his study, immersed in papers. "We need to establish some rules," she said, closing the door behind her. Griffin looked up, surprised by her initiative. "I'm listening. First, I don't want my position as your wife to interfere with my work. The mansion still needs to be managed." "I agree," he nodded, "but you'll have to delegate more. A Morrison wife doesn't clean her own toilets." Alma took a deep breath, controlling her irritation. "Secondly, I need the freedom to continue my evening studies." That captured Griffin's full attention. "Studies? Business administration course? Online? I've been doing it for 2 years." A small smile appeared on his lips, the first genuine one she'd seen in days. "Impressive. Why didn't you mention it before?" "You never asked," she replied simply. The silence that followed was different from the previous ones. There was a new mutual understanding being born there, a discovery that perhaps they didn't know each other as well as they thought. "The social worker is coming next week." Griffin changed the subject, returning to business mode. "We need to look convincing." "I've already thought of that," Alma replied, surprising him again. "We should know each other's history, details that only a couple would know." Griffin studied her for a moment, as if seeing her in a new light. "Like your favorite color?" "Green," she replied. "And yours is navy blue, like the ties you always wear to important meetings." He blinked, surprised. "How?" "5 years of watching Mr. Morrison," she smiled slightly. "It's my job to pay attention to detail." That night, lying in the king-size bed in the master suite, Griffin had insisted on sleeping in the guest room. Alma gazed up at the ornate ceiling. The last 24 hours had completely transformed her life. From housekeeper to Mrs. Morrison, from employee to wife, from observer to active participant in this elaborate theater. On the other side of the mansion, Griffin was also awake, unconsciously reviewing every interaction of the day. Alma had surprised him several times, showing an insight and strength of character that he hadn't expected. Perhaps, he thought, There was more to this arrangement than just convenience. The full moon illuminated the gardens of Hampton Manor, casting shadows to the ancient windows. Somewhere between those centuries-old walls, three lonely people were trying to forge a family out of unlikely circumstances. Fate, with its sense of irony, had brought together a workaholic millionaire, a studious governess, and an orphan boy under one roof, connected by a diamond ring and a series of well-intentioned lies. But as any good businessman knew, even the best planned lies have a habit of falling apart under pressure, and the pressure was only just beginning. The social worker's visit was scheduled for 2 in the afternoon, and the Hampton mansion had been buzzing with nervous energy since dawn. Alma was overseeing the last details of the cleaning when she found an old photograph lying behind a bookcase in the library. In it, a young Griffin was smiling next to a beautiful woman in a rose garden. "Isabel," Griffin's voice sounded behind her, startling her. "My ex-fiancée." Alma turned around, embarrassed at having been caught snooping. "I'm sorry, I was just—" "It's okay," he interrupted, picking up the photograph carefully. "It's part of our agreement, isn't it? Knowing each other's history." For the first time since the wedding, Griffin looked vulnerable. "She left me 3 days before the wedding. She said she couldn't live with someone who loved work more than people. And she was right?" Alma asked softly. Griffin put the photo away in a drawer. "At the time, yes. Maybe she still is." The moment of intimacy was interrupted by Michael, who rushed into the library. "Aunt Alma, Uncle Griffin, look what I've drawn." The drawing showed 3 stick figures, a tall one with a tie, a medium-sized one with a dress, and a small one in the middle, all holding hands. "Our family," he explained proudly. Alma felt a lump in her throat. Griffin crouched down beside his nephew, running his hand through his hair. "That's perfect, champ." The arrival of Jennifer Walsh, the social worker, brought everyone back to the reality of their situation. She was a perceptive, middle-aged woman, with eyes that seemed to see right through people. "So," she began, sitting down in the living room, "tell me how your relationship began." Griffin and Alma exchanged a quick glance. They had rehearsed this part. "It was gradual," Griffin began, his voice softer than usual. "Alma always had a special way of organizing not just the house, but our lives. After Ryan and Claire passed away, she was our safe haven. Michael needed stability," Alma continued, surprised by the truth in her own words. "And Griffin needed someone to remind him that there is life beyond work." Jennifer watched them intently, and the difference in social classes was never a problem. The question hit an exposed nerve. Alma straightened up in her chair. "I grew up in San Diego, the daughter of immigrants who worked hard to give me an education. I learned that a person's worth isn't in their bank account." Griffin took her hand, a gesture they hadn't agreed on. "And I learned that all the money in the world can't buy the kind of wisdom and strength that Alma possesses." The social worker made some notes. "Michael seems very attached to you both." "Alma has always been special to him," Griffin replied, "even before us." After inspecting the house and a long conversation with Michael, Jennifer finally left, promising to return in a few weeks. As the door closed, Alma let out the breath she hadn't realized she was holding. "You were brilliant," Griffin complimented, pouring himself a whiskey. "I just told the truth," Alma replied, surprised at herself. "About Michael, about valuing people beyond money." Griffin studied her for a moment. "Why haven't we talked like this before?" "Because you were my boss, and I was your housekeeper. Some walls are hard to break down." That night, after Michael had gone to sleep, Alma found Griffin in the rose garden, the same as in the photographs with Isabel. He was lost in thought, gazing at the flowers. "You know," she began, "when I lost my parents, I thought I'd never have a family again. That I'd always be the girl who cleaned other people's houses to pay for college." Griffin turned to her. "And now? Now I understand that family isn't about blood or money. It's about choices. We chose to be here for Michael." "Not just for Michael," Griffin murmured, so low that Alma almost didn't hear. The silence that followed was full of unspoken possibilities. The roses swayed gently in the night breeze, their red petals glowing in the moonlight. "I found this today," Griffin said, handing her an envelope. Inside were registration forms for the University of Connecticut. The campus is 30 minutes away. It would be better than online classes. Alma looked at the papers, stunned. Griffin, I can't. Yes, you can. A Morrison deserves the best education possible. He smiled, a genuine smile that reached his eyes. Besides, I need someone who understands business to remind me to be home by dinner time. At that moment, something changed between them. The masks they wore, he as a cold businessman, she as a submissive employee, began to crack, revealing the people behind the roles they played. From his window on the second floor, Michael watched the two of them chatting in the garden, his drawing of the family still held in his small hands. For him, there was no pretense or convenience, just the simple, pure love of a child who had found, in the ruins of his personal tragedy, a new chance at happiness. The headline in the Greenwich Times caught the attention of everyone in the mansion. Morrison Aaron's surprise wedding to employee. Griffin threw the newspaper on the breakfast table in irritation. The news they had tried to keep discreet was now on the front page of the local paper, complete with a photo of the couple leaving the courthouse. It was inevitable, Alma commented, pouring coffee for Griffin while trying to stay calm. Greenwich is a small town by their standards. Griffin's phone rang and it was Charlotte Morrison, his aunt and matriarch of the Morrison clan. I imagine she's already seen the paper, he muttered, letting the call go to voicemail. You can't avoid her forever, Alma observed, taking a seat at the table for the first time since she started working there. The simple act still seemed strange, forbidden. I can try, Griffin replied, but his tone revealed concern. Charlotte Morrison was known for her power in Greenwich society and her uncompromising views on maintaining family standards. Michael entered the dining room, still in his pajamas, dragging his favorite teddy bear. Why is our picture in the paper? Alma and Griffin exchanged glances. Because people are happy that we're a family now, Alma replied softly, pulling the little boy onto her lap. The moment was interrupted by the arrival of Marcus, the driver, announcing that the car to take Michael to school was ready. While Alma helped the boy get ready, Griffin received another call, this time from his lawyer. The adoption papers are progressing, he informed Alma as he returned to the living room. But we have a bigger problem. The board of Morrison Enterprises is questioning my stability after the recent decisions. They think that marrying me affects your ability to lead the company, Alma concluded, her calm voice masking the hurt. They don't know you, Griffin replied, surprising her with the vehemence in his voice. They don't know that you're studying management, that you understand more about efficient management than half of those executives. The world you live in isn't ready to accept someone like me, Griffin. Then maybe it's time to change that world. The determination in his voice made her face him. Over the last few days, she had been discovering layers of Griffin that she had never imagined existed beneath the facade of the ruthless businessman. One afternoon, while organizing some documents in her office, Alma found an old photo album. In it, she saw Griffin and Ryan as children, playing in the same gardens where Michael now played. There were also photos of their parents Eleanor and James Morrison at social events, always impeccable and distant. They died when I was 16 and Ryan was 14, Griffin said, quietly entering the office. Plane crash. Charlotte raised us after that. That must have been horrid. That's when I learned that control and success in business was the only way to guarantee security, he admitted, taking a seat next to her. Ryan was different. He lived every moment intensely, without fear. Like Michael, Alma smiled softly. Exactly like Michael. Griffin touched one of the photos. You know what's ironic? Ryan always said that I needed to learn to really live, not just exist. And now, to protect his son, I'm in a sham marriage. Are you sure it's all a lie? The words escaped before Alma could contain them. The silence that followed was interrupted by the doorbell. It was Charlotte Morrison, imposing in her Chanel ensemble, her icy blue eyes scanning Alma up and down. So it's true, she said, entering uninvited. You really did marry the maid? Housekeeper, Griffin corrected, his voice sharp. And yes, I married Alma. Darling, I know you've been suffering since Ryan's death, but that's self-destruction. Actually, Alma intervened, surprising them both. It's about building a family for Michael, a future that honors Ryan and Claire's memory. Charlotte turned to her. eyes blazing. And how much did that inspirational speech cost, dear? What was the price for accepting this arrangement? Aunt Charlotte, that's enough. Griffin's voice thundered through the room. Alma is my wife now, and more importantly, she's the mother Michael needs. If you can't accept that, perhaps you should leave. The clash was interrupted by Michael, who was returning from school. When he saw Charlotte, he ran to hug her. She had always been a constant presence in his life, bringing gifts and treats on her visits. Aunt Charlotte, have you come for family dinner? Aunt Alma makes the best spaghetti in the world. Charlotte's expression softened at the sight of her grandnephew, but her eyes still held a promise of future battles. Another day, dear. Aunt Charlotte has other commitments today. After his departure, Griffin found Alma in the kitchen, preparing dinner with more vigor than necessary. I'm sorry about her, he began. Don't be. She's only protecting what she considers important, the Morrison legacy. The Morrison legacy, Griffin repeated bitterly. You know what's funny? Ever since we got married, even if only for convenience, I've felt more alive than I have in years. Maybe the real Morrison legacy needs redefining. Alma stopped chopping the tomatoes, turning to face him. What do you mean? I mean that maybe Ryan was right. Maybe I needed to learn how to really live. He moved closer, gently touching her face. And maybe I'm starting to. The moment was interrupted by Michael entering the kitchen with his sketchbook, but something had changed. The invisible walls that separated their worlds were beginning to show cracks, and through them, a new possibility was beginning to blossom. The news of Griffin Morrison's marriage to his housekeeper had spread like wildfire through Greenwich, generating a wave of speculation and gossip in the most exclusive social circles. But inside Hampton Manor, a different routine was beginning to take hold. Alma now divided her time between her classes at the University of Connecticut, supervising the house and spending time with Michael. Evenings were filled with surprisingly in-depth discussions with Griffin about business, as she shared her knowledge from class and he offered practical insights into the corporate world. The problem with the new project in Boston, Alma commented one night, looking over some reports Griffin had brought home, is that you're ignoring the community impact. People don't just want another luxury commercial building, they need spaces that add value to the neighborhood. Griffin watched her curiously. Go on. Why not include a public library on the first floor? Or a community center? Something that shows that Morrison Enterprises cares about more than profits. Like your mother did with the bakery in San Diego? Griffin asked softly, remembering a story she had told him about her past. Alma agreed, surprised that he had remembered. She always said that a business without heart is just a money-making machine. Before Griffin could reply, Michael rushed into the office, agitated. Aunt Alma, will you promise not to get angry? In her small hands, she held the pearl necklace that had belonged to Griffin's mother, a family heirloom that Charlotte had insisted Alma should wear at social events. The necklace was broken, loose pearls scattered in his palm. It was an accident, he explained, tears in his eyes. I just wanted to see the pictures in the jewelry box. Griffin stood up, but Alma was quicker, kneeling beside the boy. It's all right, darling. They're just pearls. What matters is that you're all right. But Aunt Charlotte said it was very important, Michael sobbed, that it was part of the Morrison story. Hey, Griffin joined them on the floor, something the old Griffin would never do. You know what's more important than any necklace? You, our family. Alma felt her heart race when she heard Griffin use the word family so naturally. In recent days, the moments of pretense had become increasingly rare, replaced by a genuine intimacy that frightened her. Later, after putting Michael to bed, Alma found Griffin in the winter garden, contemplating the broken pearls. I'm sorry about the necklace, she said. I know how much it meant to your family. To be honest, Griffin replied, I never really liked it. My mother wore it to every social event, always so concerned with appearances. It was as if the pearls were a chain, binding her to a role she needed to play. Like our wedding? Alma couldn't help asking. Griffin turned to her, his eyes reflecting the soft lights of the garden. No, that's different. How can you be sure? Because for the first time in my life, I'm not pretending. The board meetings, the social events, the ruthless manager, that was acting. He moved closer, gently touching her face. With you and Michael, I can just be me. The moment was interrupted by the sound of the doorbell. It was late for visitors, and something in the air changed instantly. At the door stood Isabel, Griffin's ex-fiancée, as elegant as in the old photograph. "Sorry to barge in on you like this," she said, her eyes assessing Alma. "But we need to talk, Griffin." The silence that followed was as thick as fog. Alma felt the weight of 1,000 unspoken words between the former fiancés. "Anything can wait until tomorrow at the office," Griffin replied firmly. "No, it can't," Isabel insisted. "It's about the merger with my father's company. The board is using your sudden marriage as an argument against the deal." Alma took a step back, suddenly feeling like an intruder in her own home. "I'll check if Michael's asleep." "Alma," Griffin called, but she had already disappeared up the stairs. In Michael's room, Alma found the boy awake, hugging his teddy bear. "I heard voices," he said sleepily. "Just a work visit for Uncle Griffin," she replied, sitting down on the edge of the bed. "Do you want me to tell you a story?" As she recounted yet another adventure of dragons and knights, Alma tried not to think about the conversation going on downstairs. She had no right to feel jealous. Her marriage was just an agreement, after all. But when Griffin appeared at the bedroom door an hour later, finding Alma asleep next to Michael, something in her chest tightened. Carefully, he covered them both with an extra blanket. "You know," he whispered into the silent room, "I think I finally understand what Ryan always tried to tell me about family." The next day, the sun rose over a different Hampton mansion. The broken pearls were kept, not to be fixed, but as a reminder that sometimes you have to break old traditions to build something new and truer. News of Isabel's visit spread quickly through the corridors of Morrison Enterprises. Griffin found his office full of curious looks and barely concealed whispers when he arrived for the board meeting that morning. Alma had left early for her university classes, leaving only a terse note. "Michael has a presentation at school at 2 p.m. The formality of the note bothered him more than it should have. In recent weeks, his morning notes had always included little personal remarks or words of encouragement. This sudden coldness was a painful reminder of how much their dynamic had changed since Isabel's appearance. "The board is concerned, Griffin," Stanley Weber, the longest-serving member, declared during the meeting. "First, the impulsive marriage to your employee. Now this resistance to the merger with Hartley Industries. We no longer recognize the executive who built this empire." Griffin adjusted his tie, feeling the weight of the wedding ring on his finger. "Maybe it's because I'm finally seeing beyond the numbers, Stanley. Merging with Hartley would mean laying off 300 employees in Boston. Since when does that matter to you?" Isabel intervened from the opposite end of the table. "The Griffin the first knew would do whatever was necessary for the good of the company." "The Griffin you knew was alone," he replied, surprising everyone with his frankness. "Now I have a family to consider." "A family of lies," Isabel retorted, her eyes blazing with defiance. Griffin stood up abruptly. "The meeting is adjourned. And as for the merger, my answer is no." Rushing out of the office, he arrived at Michael's school just 5 minutes before the presentation was due to start. He found Alma already sitting in the front row, her face lighting up briefly at the sight of him before resuming the neutral expression of the last few days. "I thought you weren't coming," she whispered when he sat down. "I'd never miss it," he replied, noticing how she had styled her hair differently, more elegantly, for her university classes. Michael appeared on stage dressed as an astronaut, part of a presentation on dreams and professions. "When I grow up," he declared into the microphone, "I want to explore space like my father wanted me to. And now I know I can, because I have a family that believes in me." Alma felt tears welling up in her eyes, remembering conversations with Claire about how Ryan had always been fascinated by astronomy. Griffin discreetly offered her a tissue. After the presentation, while Michael proudly showed off his spacesuit to his colleagues, Griffin pulled Alma to a more private corner of the auditorium. "We need to talk about yesterday." "There's nothing to talk about," Alma replied, nervously adjusting the strap of her student bag. "Isabel is your past, and I'm part of a deal." "Is that what you think? That after everything we've experienced over the last few weeks, you're just part of a deal? And I'm not?" She finally faced him, her eyes revealing a mixture of hurt and vulnerability. I saw the way you looked at her yesterday, Griffin. There was history there. There were memories of a man. I'm not anymore, he interrupted her, taking a step towards her. A man who thought success was measured only by numbers on a spreadsheet. And who are you now? Someone who learns every day? Someone who has discovered that family is not something you inherit or buy, but something you build with small moments? He smiled softly, like helping with homework at the kitchen table, or listening to dragon stories before bed. Alma felt her heart racing, but years of self-preservation made her pull back. Griffin, we can't. Why not? He took her hands, ignoring the curious looks from the other parents. Because you were my housekeeper? Why weren't you born in Greenwich? Alma, you've taught me more about integrity and strength in the last few months than I learned in years at Harvard. And the council? Your aunt? Everyone in Greenwich who thinks this is a scandal. Let them think what they like. For the first time in my life, I'm making decisions not because of what other people expect, but because of what I know is right. The moment was interrupted by Michael, running towards her with a piece of cake from the post-show party. Aunt Alma, prove it. Tommy's mom made it, but it's not as good as your cookies. Alma laughed, discreetly wiping away a tear. Nobody needs to know that, dear. Let's be polite. Griffin watched the interaction, amazed at how naturally Alma moved between her various roles as college student, mother at heart, and, yes, his wife. No longer just on paper, but in every little gesture and shared moment. That night, after putting Michael to bed, they met again in the winter garden. The city lights twinkled in the distance, creating an almost magical scene among the plants and flowers. Did you really refuse the merger? Alma asked, breaking the silence. Yes, and tomorrow I'm going to present a new project for Boston, including your idea for the library and community center. She looked at him in surprise. You're going to use my suggestion? Why not? It's time Morrison Enterprises had a bit more heart, don't you think? The smile she gave him was worth more than all the mergers in the world. The doors of the Morrison Enterprises boardroom opened violently as Charlotte Morrison entered, her heels echoing across the marble floor. Griffin was in the middle of a presentation about the new community project in Boston when her aunt interrupted the meeting. This is unacceptable, she declared, waving the latest financial report. First a scandalous marriage, now you want to turn a profitable venture into a charity project? Griffin kept his cool, years of tough negotiations having strengthened his self-control. The community center and public library will increase the value of the property in the long term, as well as creating goodwill with the local community. Her idea, isn't it? Charlotte asked, her tone cutting. His wife? Yes, Griffin replied without hesitation, and it's a brilliant idea. Alma is studying business administration and understands the value of corporate social investment. Across town, at the University of Connecticut, Alma was presenting a paper on corporate social responsibility when her phone vibrated. It was a message from Michael. Aunt Alma, I forgot my science project at home. Help. She smiled, remembering the papier-mâché volcano they had built together at the weekend. I'm on my way, darling. On the way to school, Alma reflected on how her life had changed. A few months ago, she was just the housekeeper at Hampton Manor, invisible to the world of Greenwich. Now, she was balancing university studies, family responsibilities, and a marriage that, although it had started as an arrangement, had turned into something deeper. Arriving at Michael's school, she found Griffin already there, volcano in hand. Great minds think alike, he smiled, handing over the project. How did you? Michael texted both of us, he explained, and the board meeting ended earlier than expected. After Charlotte, did your aunt show up? Alma felt her stomach tighten. Yes, but this time it was different. Griffin touched her face gently. I defended our project. I defended you. Before they could continue the conversation, Michael ran up to them, relieved to see his project. You're the best. Did you know that Tommy said that having two dads who always show up when you need them is like having superheroes? Alma and Griffin exchanged excited glances. It was true without realizing it. They had become a real team. Back at the mansion, they found Charlotte waiting for them. But this time, something was different about her posture. I spent the afternoon going over some figures, she began, surprisingly calm. and also talking to some Boston residents about the community project. Griffin and Alma braced themselves for more criticism, but Charlotte continued, "The plan is solid. Different, but solid." And she hesitated, looking at Alma. "I must admit I underestimated you." "What do you mean?" Alma asked, cautiously. "Ryan always said that Griffin needed someone to challenge him to be better, not just richer." Charlotte smiled sadly. "I guess he was right." Michael, who had been playing in the garden, came running in with an envelope. "Aunt Charlotte, look what I did in art class." It was a drawing of the family, but this time it included Charlotte, standing next to them under what looked like a rainbow made of glitter. "It's beautiful, darling," Charlotte said, her voice softening. Then, turning to Alma, "You make him smile like Claire used to." That night, after Michael had gone to sleep, Alma found Griffin in his office, going over the last details of the Boston project. "Your aunt surprised me today," she commented, taking a seat next to him. "Charlotte can be difficult, but she always puts family first," Griffin replied. "And you, whether she admits it or not, are family now." "It's funny," Alma reflected, "how we started this as a lie to give Michael a family, and in the process, we found our own truth," Griffin added, taking her hand. The touch was familiar now, comfortable in a way that neither of them had expected when they signed those papers in court. "The project in Boston," Alma changed the subject, still processing her emotions, "will need someone to oversee the implementation of the community center." "I was thinking of you, actually," Griffin revealed. "After you graduate, it would be a perfect opportunity to start your corporate career. You really believe me, don't you? From the first day I saw you organizing this house more efficiently than any CEO I've ever met." He smiled. "It just took me a while to realize that I needed your efficiency in every area of my life." The moment was interrupted by distant thunder. A storm was approaching Greenwich, and seconds later, they heard Michael's hurried footsteps down the corridor. "Can I sleep with you tonight?" he asked from the doorway, hugging his bear. Alma and Griffin looked at each other. It was the first time Michael had asked for this, the first time he had truly seen them as his parents. "Of course, champ," Griffin replied, getting up and taking the boy on his lap. That night, the three of them snuggled in the large bed in the master suite, Michael between them, protected from the storm and any other fears he might have. And while the boy slept, Alma and Griffin stayed awake, their hands intertwined on the pillow, sharing a look that said more than 1,000 words. The storm outside continued, but inside Hampton Manor, a different kind of peace was settling in, the peace of a family that had found its way through the most unlikely of circumstances. The presentation of the Boston Community Project was scheduled for an October morning, when the leaves on the Greenwich trees were beginning to turn red and gold. Alma nervously adjusted the navy blue blazer that Griffin had insisted on buying for her, his first Carolina Herrera piece. "You look beautiful," he whispered, helping her fix the collar. They were in the closet of the master suite, which had gradually become a truly shared space, their clothes blending together like their lives. "And terrified," Alma admitted. "Presenting to the board of Morrison Enterprises wasn't exactly in my plans when I started college, but it's exactly where you should be," Griffin replied, his hand resting gently on her back. The touch, once formal and calculated, now carried a natural intimacy that neither of them questioned anymore. Michael appeared in the doorway, already dressed for school, carrying something in his hands. "I did this for luck," he said, handing Alma a drawing of her wearing a superhero suit and cape. "Super Alma," she read the caption, tears welling up in her eyes. "It's perfect, darling." On the way to the office, Griffin drove in silence, respecting Alma's need to mentally review her presentation. She had spent weeks refining every detail of the project, transforming her personal experience and academic knowledge into a solid community development proposal. "Remember," he said as they parked, "you know this project better than anyone. It's your vision that will transform that neighborhood." The meeting room was packed. As well as the board, several important shareholders had turned up, curious to meet the new Mrs. Morrison who was causing such a stir in Greenwich. Isabel was there too, representing her father's interests. Alma took a deep breath and began her presentation. "The true value of an enterprise is not measured only by its financial return," she began. her voice firm despite her nervousness. "It's measured by the impact it has on the lives it touches." For 40 minutes, she presented data, projections, and case studies that demonstrated how the community center and public library would not only benefit the neighborhood, but also strengthen the Morrison Enterprises brand. Her personal experience as the daughter of immigrants who found opportunities through community programs gave emotional weight to the numbers. "This is not just a social responsibility project," she concluded. "It's an investment in the future of Boston and in the evolution of Morrison Enterprises as a company that understands that success and purpose can and must go hand in hand." The silence that followed was broken by Charlotte Morrison, who slowly stood up. "I must admit," she began, "that when Griffin announced this project, I had my doubts. But now I see what my nephew Ryan always said. Sometimes we need fresh eyes to see the path better." One by one, the board members began to show their support. Even Isabel, after a moment's hesitation, nodded in approval. "Congratulations, Ms. Morrison," she said after the meeting, surprising Alma. "You've really transformed not only the project, but also Griffin." On the way home, Griffin couldn't contain his pride. "You were incredible. The way you answered the council's questions, the way you defended every aspect of the project." "I had a good teacher," Alma smiled, remembering the evenings when they discussed business strategies over cups of tea in the library. At home, they found Michael waiting anxiously with Mrs. Bennett, the nanny. "How did it go? Did you use your superhero powers?" Alma hugged him tightly. "Even better. I used the power of good ideas." That night, after Michael had gone to sleep, Griffin found Alma in the winter garden, her usual refuge. She was still wearing her Carolina Herrera blazer, but her feet were bare on the sofa. A habit he found adorable. "I was thinking," she began, "about how life turns around. 6 months ago, I was your housekeeper, trying to save money to pay for college. Now I'm presenting million-dollar projects to businessmen, and married one of them in the process," Griffin joked, taking a seat next to her. "Yeah, that too," she smiled, but then her face turned serious. "Griffin, we need to talk about this. About us? About how we're not pretending anymore," he asked softly. "About how we never really pretended," she corrected. "Even at the beginning, when it was just an agreement, there was something more." Griffin took her hand, gently tracing the ring on her finger. "Do you know when I realized it? The day you organized that surprise birthday party for Michael. Not because it was grandiose, but because you remembered every little detail. His favorite cake, the colors he likes, even that particular dinosaur he'd mentioned months before. He's easy to love," Alma said simply. "Like you," Griffin replied, leaning in to kiss her. This time, there was no audience to convince, no social workers watching. It was just them, finally admitting what their hearts had known for months. News of the Boston Project's success spread quickly through Greenwich business circles. The Wall Street Journal published a laudatory article about Morrison Enterprises' innovative initiative, especially highlighting the new vision brought by the recent addition to the Morrison family. Alma kept a copy of the article, still surprised to see her name printed in such a prestigious newspaper. However, the joy of her professional victory was interrupted by an unexpected phone call. Social worker Jennifer Walsh requested an emergency visit to the mansion. "There have been some concerns raised," she explained vaguely over the phone. Griffin found Alma in the library, nervously organizing the books, a habit she kept from her days as a housekeeper, something she did when she needed to think. "Hey," he hugged her from behind. "It's going to be okay. What if they found out?" Alma whispered, "If someone told about how our marriage started, then we'll tell the truth that it started as an agreement, but turned into something real." Michael rushed into the library, interrupting the conversation. "Can I show my new science project to Mrs. Walsh when she comes? It's about stars, just like Dad liked." Alma's heart squeezed. Michael had started calling her Mom occasionally, especially when he was sleepy or needed comforting. It was delicate emotional territory that she navigated carefully. Jennifer Walsh arrived punctually at 2 in the afternoon, her expression more serious than usual. "We've received an anonymous tip-off," she began after settling into her office, suggesting that this marriage was arranged solely to facilitate the adoption. Alma felt her blood run cold. Griffin instinctively took her hand. The complaint specifically mentioned the speed of the marriage and the difference in social standing. Jennifer continued. It's true that our marriage was quick, Griffin admitted, surprising both Alma and the social worker. But you know what was also quick? Realizing that Alma was exactly what this family needed. Mr. Morrison, no, let me finish, he insisted. Before Alma, this mansion was just a big, empty house. Michael smiled, but his eyes were sad. I worked 16 hours a day because I had no reason to come home. Alma squeezed his hand, tears in her eyes. Now, Griffin continued, now we have family dinners where Michael tells us about his day. We have movie nights on Saturdays, with homemade popcorn and discussions about which dinosaur is the coolest. We have a wife and mother who balances college and family, showing Michael that it's never too late to pursue your dreams. Jennifer watched intently, taking notes. And yes, Alma finally found her voice. We started from different places. I was the housekeeper, he was the boss. But do you know what we discovered? That true love doesn't care about bank accounts or important surnames. As if to emphasize the point, they heard Michael's voice in the hallway, animatedly explaining his project on constellations to Charlotte, who had arrived for a surprise visit. Jennifer Walsh allowed herself a small smile. You know, in 15 years in this job, I've learned to recognize genuine families. They're not about roles or appearances, they're about moments. She closed her briefcase, like the moment I walked in and saw Michael's shoes neatly lined up in the hall, along with those of the two of you, or the photos on the wall, not just the formal ones, but the spontaneous ones, with real smiles, or the calendar in the kitchen marking doctor's appointments, school presentations, and cookie night with Momda. Alma and Griffin exchanged surprised glances. The complaint will be dismissed, Jennifer concluded. This is clearly a real family, regardless of how it started. After their departure, they found Michael and Charlotte in the winter garden, setting up a small telescope, an early Christmas present from their aunt. Dad used to say that the stars are like family, Michael commented as he adjusted the focus. Even when we can't see them all, we know they're there. Charlotte hugged her grandnephew, discreet tears in her eyes. Your father was right, darling, and sometimes we find new stars to add to our constellation. That night, after Charlotte had left and Michael had gone to sleep, Alma and Griffin remained in the garden, the telescope still pointed at the November sky. You know, Alma commented, when we signed those papers at the courthouse, I thought I was just helping a lonely man and a boy who needed a family. And I thought I was just finding a practical solution to a complex problem. Griffin smiled, pulling her close. I think we underestimate the power of small moments. Like burnt cookies in your first attempts at baking with Michael? Were you sleeping on business books in the library? Were you learning to braid his hair for school? Each shared memory was a brick in the construction of something bigger than themselves. A true family, born not of obligation or convenience, but of daily choices of love and dedication. Griffin's phone vibrated with yet another email about the Boston project, but for the first time in his professional life, he ignored the notification. There were more important things now, like teaching his son about constellations and kissing his wife under the Greenwich stars. The final adoption hearing was scheduled for a clear December morning, when the first snow of winter was beginning to cover Greenwich in its white blanket. Alma adjusted Michael's bow tie, smiling at how elegant he looked in his first suit, a miniature of the one Griffin used to wear. Nervous, champ? Griffin asked, joining them in the boys' room. A little, Michael admitted, but Aunt Charlotte said it's normal to have butterflies in your stomach on important days. The courtroom was decorated for the holidays, with discreet garlands and soft lights. Jennifer Walsh was waiting for them at the entrance, her familiar briefcase under her arm, but this time her smile was genuine and relaxed. Judge Anderson is expecting us, she informed them, leading them down the marble corridors. The courtroom was fuller than they had expected. Charlotte was there, of course, but so were several of the mansion's employees, including Mrs. Bennett. Even some members of the Morrison Enterprises board had turned up, demonstrating how the family had earned the respect of the community. Michael Morrison, Judge Anderson began, her voice gentle. Do you understand why we are here today? The boy nodded, holding Alma and Griffin's hands tightly. To officially be a family. Even though, he smiled, we've been one for a long time. A murmur of approval went through the room. The judge smiled. "Griffin and Alma Morrison," she continued, "do you understand the legal and moral responsibilities of becoming Michael's adoptive parents?" "Yes, Your Honor," they answered in unison. "Well, after reviewing all of Ms. Walsh's reports and considering Michael's extraordinary progress over the past few months, I am pleased to approve this adoption." The judge gently banged her gavel. "Congratulations, Morrison family." Applause filled the room as Michael leapt into the arms of his now official parents. Charlotte was the first to hug them, tears undisguised in her eyes. "Ryan and Claire would be so proud," she whispered, "not just for the adoption, but for how you've transformed Morrison Enterprises into something more meaningful." The celebration continued at the mansion, where a small reception had been prepared. The winter garden, now decorated for Christmas, glowed with soft lights. In the aroma of freshly baked cookies, one of Alma's specialties, filled the air. "You know what's funny?" Alma commented to Griffin as they watched Michael show off his new telescope to some guests. "A year ago, I was organizing this very Christmas party as your housekeeper, trying to stay invisible in the shadows." Griffin pulled her close. "And now? Now I understand that sometimes the best presents come disguised as impossible challenges." Jennifer Walsh approached them, carrying a briefcase. "I have something for you," she said, handing over an envelope. "These are the letters Michael wrote during our follow-up sessions." Later, after the guests had left and Michael had gone to sleep, exhausted but happy, Alma and Griffin sat down in the library to read the letters. "Dear Diary," began one of them, in Michael's childish handwriting, "today Aunt Alma taught me how to make cookies like Mom used to. She doesn't know it, but sometimes when she smiles, she looks like Mommy. And when Uncle Griffin takes me to see the stars, it's like Daddy's there too. Is it strange having two sets of parents to love?" Alma couldn't hold back her tears. Griffin hugged her tightly. "He's right, you know," she said after a moment, "about having two sets of parents to love. Ryan and Claire will always be his biological parents, but we're the parents he chose," Griffin added, "just like we chose each other, even if we didn't know it at first." Griffin's phone vibrated with an email about the Boston project. The community center was progressing rapidly, and Alma had already been invited to oversee similar projects in other cities. "Who knew," she smiled, "that your housekeeper would become an executive at Morrison Enterprises?" "I would," Griffin replied. "Ever since that first presentation, when you defended the project with such passion and intelligence, you've always been more than any title or position." A soft noise interrupted them as Michael stood in the doorway, drowsy. "Nightmare, dear?" Alma asked, holding out her arms. "No," he replied, snuggling between them on the sofa. "I just wanted to make sure it wasn't a dream, that we really are a real family now. Forever," Griffin promised, kissing the top of his head. As Michael fell asleep between them again, Alma reflected on how life could change in a year. From the loneliness of a housekeeper to the fullness of a family. From an agreement of convenience to true, deep love. "What are you thinking about?" Griffin asked softly. "About how sometimes we need to lose something to find something greater," she replied. "Ryan and Claire left us too soon, but their love created Michael, who brought us together, who transformed not only our lives, but an entire company." Griffin nodded, understanding. Morrison Enterprises was no longer just a business empire. It was a legacy of positive change, inspired by a housekeeper who dared to dream bigger and an entrepreneur who learned that success is measured by the impact we make on the lives of others. The snow continued to fall outside, covering Greenwich with its silent purity. Inside the Hampton mansion, a family rested in the library, their individual stories now intertwined in a larger narrative of love, loss, and redemption. And somewhere, Ryan and Claire Morrison smiled, knowing that their son was exactly where he should be in the arms of two people who had turned a well-intentioned lie into the purest of truths.